Good evening, everyone. We are very happy to have you here for the second Pelicam Talks. This time the topic is biodiversity between extinction and species return. We have with us this evening Rosaleen Duffy. She's professor at the University of Sheffield. She has done research on wildlife conservation and ecotourism, peace parks, and international environmental agreements. And she leads the BioSec project, a research project exploring the growing interrelations between conservation and global security. Monica Vasile is also with us. She's a researcher at the Maastricht University, and she's part of the Moving Animals project. Monica researches the role of scientists and science in wildlife conservation, reintroduction of species, and rewilding. Floor van der Leuven is also with us. Van der Meulen, I'm sorry, is also with us today. She's director of The Last Male on Earth, the documentary that you have just watched, and the documentary is part of the international competition. And we hope that in a couple of minutes, Martin Pav will also join us. He is director of Wolves at the Border, the documentary that we screened last week as part of the Eastern Docs competition. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
I would like to remind the audience that you can post your questions below the live chat or on the website where you saw the screening. Please get into the discussion, and I will just take the questions from the chat and post them to our distinguished guests. We choose this year the biodiversity as one of the main themes of our festival, and we screened at least 3 documentaries. Some of the documentaries are part of the international competition, while others are part of the Eastern Docs competition. Please be with us tomorrow evening when the winners will be announced. And in the meantime, I hope you enjoy the rest of the festival. This being said, I will open the discussion by congratulating Flor for the wonderful documentary that we just screened. And I would like to ask you, Flor, do you think that the extinction of species receives enough popular and political attention? And if so, did your documentary aim at changing this situation?
Well, that would be great if my film, of course, made a change in that situation. But as I understood, like, I'm not a specialist on biology or something like this. I just stumbled upon the subject of Sudan being the last male of his species, or subspecies actually. And he became like world famous actually because he was the last one. But it's quite sad that he had to become the last one to gain that interest of the world, or the broader interest of the world. I think scientists were already interested in the species, but he had to become the last male for us to wake up and to understand, shit, this is happening, this is quite serious. And then when I researched the film or the story, of course, I came across people who have much more knowledge on this subject, and that there are thousands of species dying every day, and extinction is happening every day, I think. It's just that not all the species we are aware of it, or they are not as sexy. Like the rhino is pretty big, so, and everybody knows the rhino. As Elodie is also saying in the film, if we don't care about rhinos, will people care about the smaller animals or even the insects? And of course, making a film showing how we deal with the fact that Sudan is the last male, and we have different ways of going about it, might make a change, but I'm not too optimistic in this sense that, yes, the scientists are working really hard and they are progressing actually a lot after I finished the film, but more people should care, I think, and that's the big question, I think.
Thank you. Sudan belongs to a charismatic species, and he's a super charismatic individual. I would like to ask Rosaleen to tell us a few words about how important is charisma of a certain species in conservation, in framing conservation programs, in attracting funding, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, charisma is really important in conservation, and there are a whole series of different arguments around it. So there will be some within the sort of conservation community who'll say, yes, there can be an over-focus on charismatic species, but it drives funding towards the organisations, and then that funding can be used to sort of support conservation initiatives for a range of species or for whole ecosystems. So they act as this kind of cornerstone or keystone type species. But there is there are a couple of different issues with that as well. I mean, the charismatic species, the focus on rhinos then might create blind spots around other species which may be more threatened, and then they don't receive the same kinds of attention or funding. Insects is a really good example, as Flor mentioned. So we have to kind of work out, is there a trickle-down effect from focusing on a charismatic species and then all other species benefit? Or does that focus on a charismatic species just mean that people can then forget about all the other really important species as well? And I think as well, within the rhino, within just looking at the rhinos, Sudan himself became this big kind of celebrity and charismatic creature. And there's all this focus and also funding on trying to sort of to resurrect the species from near extinction and then extinction. And there were always criticisms that money was being poured into that and not into saving the rhinos for other more viable populations or other more viable species, subspecies of rhinos as well. It's charisma across species, but also within species, which can create those blind spots, which we need to really be careful about. But charisma is really central. And in fact, there's another group of researchers, Bob Smith has written a paper about it, that, there are some species that are Cinderella species, and that's a real problem because they don't get the attention that they need and deserve.
Do you think that also the funding goes for charisma and the political discussions, for example, in the EU?
Yes, I really think it does. And it's not just funding. So it's in a sense, public interest and public donations or philanthropy donations flow towards charismatic species. Those are the ones that get the big headlines. It can make donors, philanthropists and the public feel or look like they're actually doing something to address the biodiversity crisis. But I think it also correlates to the kinds of levels of forceful forms of enforcement of conservation. So we do see heavily armed rangers, or we do see militarized forms of conservation around rhinos, but we won't see that around a very endangered species of bat or a hedgehog in the United Kingdom. The idea that you would have armed SWAT teams for a bat, a butterfly or a hedgehog, people would think was laughable, but for a whole host of different reasons, which we can talk about later on, it's deemed as acceptable when we're talking about rhinos, elephants and tigers, where they're the charismatic species. So certainly funding, I think, is driven towards charismatic species, but then charisma also shapes what we deem to be acceptable forms of conservation.
Thank you so much, Rosaleen. Yes, Monica, please.
I can bring you also a perspective from history. So in the 70s, the 60s, it was the so-called the game species that were favored for conservation, because it was hunters who realized that these species are dwindling, because we had all of the big explorers and the safaris and so on, and it was the hunters who kind of called the alarm on different species. So this is also one of the reasons why it's so biased towards mammals. And there have been quite a few studies that show that actually not only conservation, but even study and animal science is this what is called the taxonomic bias towards mammals, for example. And then what is also interesting is, as a science and biology perspective, is that to attract funding and to be able to put forward projects, you have to be very strict in defining a species. What is a species? Because, for example, if a population or a so-called subspecies is disappearing, it's not enough. It has to be a species or the endling of the species, or this kind of, so to say, labels are very important as well.
Monica, you have done, yes, please, continue.
No, it was just interesting to say, like, Sudan is the northern white rhino, which to most people is a subspecies, but indeed, as you mentioned, for the scientists, it was very important to say that it was a species that was going extinct, because that way you get the funding that you need. So there's all these rules, and well, it's a whole world out there that is so complicated, whether you can save a species or a subspecies. It was very intriguing for me as an outsider to understand this all of a sudden. So yeah, it's good to hear.
Thank you so much. Monica, you have done research on species reintroduction also in Romania. And we have the European bison, who is pretty charismatic and draws a lot of attention. Can you tell us a few details about what was the role of science in bringing this species not back to life, but increasing the chances of survival and taking back the landscapes that were their own?
So if we talk about European bison was gained the interest of scientists, so to say, of museum scientists, especially in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And then there was a big action in the beginning of the 20th century to establish this kind of breeding centers that basically saved the species in a way. And they were established so before World War II in Germany, but many also in Poland. And then with the World War II, there was a separation between East and West. And so it kind of these breeding centers got separated, and then a lot of focus was on the Polish bison, and somehow there was not that much of the post-Cold War science, so to say, on European bison. And we see with American species, for example, that the science of conservation kind of explodes in the 70s and the 80s, and this didn't happen in the East, for example, which was detrimental to the European bison. And we can see this today because the conservation science of European bison only really takes off in the late 2000s and only from 2010 onwards. And we see more and more scientific production on that. So what we have is a management. So we have managers of these breeding centers, we have managers of these reserves who have experience with the animal, but they are not proper scientists in a way. And so only now we see this kind of movement towards integrating science and management. But in Romania, for example, the case that I researched, there is still no science, so to say. It was surprising for me in a way that I talked to the local rangers that take care of the bison in southwestern Romania. And they said, oh, we don't have funding in our project to pay scientists. We would like them to come and to work on it. And I said, well, you don't have to have money in your project to pay anybody. It works in another way. But yeah, so bison, European bison in that way is a species that didn't benefit from a lot of science. And maybe now, but that's very different, and they are very different situations and very different species from that point of view, so to say. And for some species the science kind of began very early in the 60s, and they this kind of interdisciplinary approaches, and it was amazing what they could do to save populations and species.
Thank you so much, Monica, for this insight. And I would like to go back to the documentary. We see that the managers of this conservancy work with scientists to make sure of the survival of the species. Other approaches are working together with anti-poaching units. And in your documentary, Flor, militarized conservation is a big theme. Was this from the beginning something that you wanted to focus on, or it emerged while you were doing the shooting?
Well, this whole documentary, actually, for me, it started with a picture of Sudan in a Dutch newspaper. I saw a picture of Sudan surrounded by 4 armed guys in camouflage. And there was not really an article. It just said, northern white rhino needs 24/7 security because he's the last one or something like so. Pretty epic title, and that's what intrigued me, thinking, wow, to my knowledge, rhinos are one of the most dangerous mammals alive, and now it's the other way around, that a rhino needs a bodyguard team. What's going on? So that was my starting point, actually, going into the documentary. And then I went to Kenya to actually meet Sudan and to see what the story would be, or could be. And when I arrived there, there were actually many filmmakers, people from the BBC and all kinds of filmmakers from all over the world that were drawn to this notion of the last male. So I thought, I'm too late. The film is already, like, everybody's making this film. And then I thought it's actually quite intriguing how do you say, the attraction of him being the last one, that everybody wants to meet him, wants to make a story about him. And that became the focus of the film, actually. So we sort of zoomed out to look at the story, or the theater, as you could say, around this last male. And where was I going with this? So yeah, actually in the beginning, it was a story about Sudan and his caretakers, like James, because James is just this amazing person that is so close to this animal, which for me as a Western person was like, I've never seen something like that. And then we made it broader in the sense that I thought there's a lot of people involved actually in the story of this last male, and part of it is also the militarization of the conservation, indeed, and how these guys again are trained by an ex-British commando. So there's many layers in the story that were interesting to me, to see what does it all encounter to save this species, or at least protect it, and yeah, try to bring it back from the brink of extinction. And protecting them is a part of it, but as I understood, and as also I think Pete mentions in the documentary, it's also a livelihood. It's a way for people to have jobs in that area. So it's not only about conservation, it's also about economics, actually, and about yeah, creating jobs. And so it's much more than just there's not only like the ecological or biological values depending on the species, but there's also livelihoods depending on the survival of the rhinos, actually.
There is one very important scene in the documentary when one of the rangers describes his equipment and what he needs, and he says, this is what it means to be an equipped soldier. He doesn't refer to himself as a ranger, but a soldier.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I would like to ask if Rosaleen can comment a bit on the history of militarizing conservation, mostly the recent history of militarizing conservation and how we got here.
Yeah, it's a really big topic. There's so much to say about it. I'll try to sort of summarize it. But there is a really long history of the use of force in conservation in sub-Saharan Africa, which dates to the early colonial period. And so there's been this kind of long-term almost acceptance that it's possible and permissible, or even desirable, to use violent force, including deadly force, to protect wildlife. Now, there are a whole series of problems with that. So in the 1980s, we see this kind of war for biodiversity. That's in the post-independence period, but most post-independence African states continued with the kinds of policies that were seen in the colonial era in conservation. We saw this kind of war for biodiversity in the 1980s, which was primarily focused around elephants in East Africa because of the crash in elephant populations as a result of hunting for ivory. And then once there was the ivory ban in 1989 under the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, it meant that, you know, elephant ivory and rhino horn, it kind of dropped out of the headlines until around about 2008, when we see spikes in both elephant and rhino poaching again in East and in Southern Africa. And from that date, I think we can see a massive expansion of militarized forms of conservation across lots of different protected areas and private conservancies in sub-Saharan Africa. So Ol Pejeta is not alone. It's not an exceptional case. It's very much the norm. But one of the things that's rendered invisible by these discussions about things like, well, it's a livelihood for the rangers or it's a livelihood for people in the area, is what's rendered invisible to tourists in particular is that there's a history of often very violent dispossession and ongoing exclusion to create these wilderness areas so that people can go and look at these animals on holiday, so that wealthy Western tourists primarily, although increasingly they're coming from other parts of the world, so that wealthy people can go and look at these animals on holiday, is that the landscapes have been entirely engineered by the removal of African communities. And that's part of the reason why there's an ongoing resistance to protected areas and to private conservancies, because they don't benefit the very communities who it's in living memory that their families and their communities have been violently evicted from these spaces. And so the economic argument around safari tourism is also used to continue a sort of a justification for the maintenance of highly unequal land distribution that's racially skewed in East Africa and in Southern Africa. And there is increasing resistance against this by lots of different groups lots of different groups who sort of arguing for decolonising conservation, is that we need to understand that this history is there, and that for some people it's not a history, actually it's an ongoing system of exclusion and dispossession. So militarization has been an answer that the conservation community has very quickly turned to. And there are lots of different arguments, which are very strong arguments to go down the sort of militarized route. You know, they argue that they're facing armed and highly organized poaching groups. And then the only option they've got is to also become heavily armed and become much more organised and engage in military training of their rangers. But I think well, there are many problems with it, but one of the problems for the rangers is that the job of rangers is changing so rapidly, so that people who came into the service in national parks or in conservancies, who came in to be rangers and to work in conservation, are increasingly finding that they're acting like soldiers. So the equipment's changing, the clothing's changing, and that's changing the type of recruit that's going into conservation as well. So it's changing the nature of the ranger's role, but it's also can have a negative effect for local communities who bear the brunt of the more militarised forms, because there are different forms of poaching, and in some of the more recent sort of media stories around the private conservancies in Kenya, because the tourism revenues have dropped, there's this kind of easy jump to make, well, the tourism revenues are dropping and poaching is rising. But what they're not saying is it's not rhinos per se that are being poached, it's small game, it's things for people to subsist on. And so we need to look at why people are drawn into the poaching economy in the first place and tackle that. Whereas militarization doesn't do that. Militarization deals with the symptoms of much bigger societal problems, much bigger structural, economic and political problems, which date from the colonial splitting of wildlife from people and that artificial separation of people from wildlife to create these spaces. As Monica said earlier on, in many places, those spaces were created to allow access for wealthy European sport hunters during the colonial period and to exclude any African hunting. And so we have our current definitions of what constitutes poaching absolutely rely on those historical colonial definitions of what constitutes illegal use of wildlife. And so it's African methods of hunting that got criminalised, and European sport hunting methods were rendered legal, sporting and gentlemanly, and therefore permitted. And that still informs conservation practice today. So yes, we see, militarization is most definitely a growing theme in conservation, and the conservation community has turned very quickly towards that because they felt that they were facing a very urgent emergency situation. And so a security type response or a military type response seemed appropriate, but it has stored up lots and lots of problems, I think, for the future for conservation, because it's changing what conservation is.
Thank you so much, Rosaleen. If anyone else would like to comment on militarization, feel free to do so.
Well, I just something to add is that, of course, also Opegita lobbied to get the last northern white rhinos, actually. And by getting them, they had to be even more protected, or they had to be the most safe conservancy there is on the planet, I guess. So another argument for more militarization and more rangers or boots on the ground in that sense. And also there's a huge difference I noticed between like the armed guys who patrol at night, like their character, what type of people they are, versus, for instance, James, who is a daycare ranger, who is much more from local tribes who have a lot of knowledge about the environment and living with wildlife. So it was also interesting, as Rosaleen says, what kind of people are on the ground actually, and that it's changing the character, yes.
Thank you so much.
I wanted
Monica,
to
please.
say something. I think militarization in a way is the extreme form of what is going on and the extreme violence. But there are also more subtle and more insidious forms of radicalization, so to say. And what we see happening in the last 10 years, and social media perhaps has a role, is a solidification of opposed positions. So we have animal defenders and animal destroyers. We have forest defenders, forest destroyers. And these camps that become more and more apart and more embittered against each other. And so even if it doesn't reach the point of militarization, this is happening at many levels, and it's working its way towards a big problem in a way. And this discourse of crisis and all of that is amplifying all of these tendencies, I think.
Could I add something there, George, as well?
Sure, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Monica. This kind of polarization is very clear. And I think donors and philanthropists, and then also the wider public, but their donations aren't, you know, they don't, they're not as extensive as the sort of donor funding that's available and the sort of philanthropy that goes into conservation. They also bear an enormous responsibility for the shift in conservation towards a more security-oriented approach. So, for instance, as part of the research on the Biodiversitatea project, I did a very quick analysis of the 70 odd projects that were funded by the UK government under their Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund. And what it showed was that there was 10 times more funding for projects on law enforcement than for sustainable livelihoods or for demand reduction as a solution to illegal wildlife trade. Now, I should be clear that that fund, the UK government doesn't fund anything like weapons transfers or weapons purchases, but it can facilitate or pay for training. And what we have seen over the past 10 years is a massive expansion in the number of war veterans who have experience of Western-led interventions in the Middle East, from Iraq and Afghanistan, bringing the kinds of expertise that they developed in a war situation to sub-Saharan Africa to conservation. You know, they've set up their own private military companies, or they're acting as consultants. And, you know, they bring, they're often hired by conservation NGOs as advisors or as trainers. And they bring with them not just the equipment and the modes of operating, but also the attitudes of, there is my enemy, who is my enemy, who do I need to defeat, who do I need to collect intelligence on? And so I think that is also changing the situation. And again, like Monica said, there's also these kind of wider, more insidious forms. So there's a sort of expansion of surveillance and informant networks, which also comes from counterinsurgency manuals from the Middle East interventions as well, where it's about trying to find people within communities to inform on the rest of the community in order to catch poachers. without any kind of critical reflection on who constitutes a poacher and why did those people get drawn into the poaching economy in the first place, and how might we address poaching or illegal extraction of wildlife in a more sustainable, in a more humane and socially just way than simply putting up fences and purchasing loads of guns or surveillance equipment in that case.
Thank you so much for a very valuable observation, Rosaleen. I would like to go a bit to Flor and ask a question about poaching. In the documentary, it doesn't appear directly very often, although the soldiers/rangers train a lot to counteract this issue. But at some point, I think the manager of the conservancy tells us that poaching is indeed one of the big problems, and the Asian countries, or Far East, as she refers, it's one of the markets. Is this a matter of concern in the conservancy that you did your documentary? Is poaching so severe, or it's mostly a risk?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's mostly a risk. I was filming there for 4 years, and there were 2 incidents of poaching in the 4 years. Still, that's too much, of course. But if you look at South Africa, Kruger Park, the rates are much higher. So yeah, it's a risk, and in the sense, the training, it's always keeping up momentum. You have to be ready. So I hope that in the film we also show that there's training, there's every night you're walking in the dark, and there's this sort of notion of danger, but it's never really happening somehow, right? It's always, you have to always be on edge and ready to act, but it happens once or twice a year, I think. So it's a risk, and but of course also it is, they show heavily, how do you say, they show heavily prepared rangers or soldiers, as you say, yes, they are, with guns to also, that the whole area knows, right? This is a well-protected area or conservancy, do not come in. And as also Rosaleen says, it's much more about intel as well. They have people in the communities, they have eyes everywhere. They are patrolling just to show their face also to the community, to the people, to share information. Because like I understood also, to really get the poacher, the most important thing is that the communities around you are your eyes and your ears. And they are actually helping you much more than that a patrol team at night by accident stumbles upon a poacher, I think. So, but yeah, it's a risk. It's not that it's happening a lot, I think, in Opegeta. But yeah, they have to be ready every moment for it to happen. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I would like you to give us a bit of a bit more information if the tourists are informed more about this Asian consumer or this Asian market, or what's the story that they get? Where does this ivory go from that?
Yeah.
If they are offered a broader image of this market or not?
I think like in Opegeta, you can visit yourself. You can go in with your own car and just drive around and watch the animals. That way you don't get much more information than what you see. But if you take like a tour with a ranger, or if you go on the endangered species tour, as we show in the film, then you get the whole talk. Then it's really James or someone of the other guys telling you. Well, I think they really tell you that the northern white rhino, that they are in this situation because, well, poaching and other things is also that there's less land and stuff like this. And that it is also that the horn is wanted for their, well, they say medicinal or other way of use in the Asian market. So they explain to you that in Asia on the market, they used or they grind the horn for powders for medicinal, well, traditional medicine. And that's a big problem. And they also, so tourists who sign up for the endangered species tour, they get to understand much more, I think, than just the general tourist who is visiting. But yeah, you get, like James will tell you that story, and also the story about the science part of it, that what they are trying to do and how they are trying to revive the species. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Of course, poaching is one of the biggest threats to biodiversity that gets attention, both political, popular attention in social media and so on. The biosec team have done a lot of research on the drivers of demand for different endangered species, or some myths about markets where these products end to. If you would like to comment a bit, Rosaleen, on this idea of the Asian super consumer, or about public campaigns to end demand for some products, feel free to do so.
Sure, thank you. Yes, it's a really complicated issue, and I think it goes back to the point that Monica was making about, that there are, certain categories now of animal defenders and animal destroyers. And I think sometimes in the debates about the wildlife trade, Asian markets get kind of held up and demonized as the problem, and China in particular is held up as the problem. But the Europe and the US are both major consumers of wildlife, of illegally extracted wildlife products as well. And so, yes, we came up with this idea of the Asian super consumer, this kind of stereotyped idea of a Chinese person who consumes everything to do with wildlife and overconsumes. And of course, that's the figure that's sometimes presented in sort of conservation NGO campaigning, but that's not the reality. People use wildlife products for very different reasons. So if we look at something like rhino horn, I'd just really like to dispel or just make it clear to anybody that rhino horn is not and has never been used as an aphrodisiac in traditional Chinese medicine. That was a myth that arose out of European and Asian traders in the colonial period, when traders wanted to expand their markets into Europe and thought that colonial markets, or the markets in Europe, would be more interested in it if they were told it was an aphrodisiac. So it's never actually been used in Asia as an aphrodisiac. What it is used for, and what it is listed for, and has been listed for centuries, is as a cardiotonic or an aspirin-like substance. So it's used as a blood thinner and as a cardiotonic. And so when we see campaigns that say using rhino horn is like biting your fingernails, that's something that appeals to a Western audience and is intelligible and understandable to a Western audience, but it just doesn't resonate with an Asian audience. They're just, people who are used in traditional Chinese medicine will think, why are they saying that when we, this is nothing to do with how we use rhino horn. So those kinds of campaigns really do need to take account of the nuances of how and why wildlife products are used, what new markets erupt, because a new market in rhino horn erupted in Vietnam as a form of conspicuous consumption with a growing middle class and a growing wealthy elite. So we need to look at those nuances, who uses it and why, and are the campaigns that are designed often by Western conservation NGOs appropriate and culturally sensitive, and actually speak to consumers in a way that's not patronising and is in a way that really engages with those consumers. And so far, I think those kinds of demand reduction campaigns haven't been as successful as they could have been. And that's in part because there's a disconnect between why people actually might use rhino horn and the sort of campaigns that are designed to prevent people from using rhino horn. So the driver of demand for rhino horn is definitely East Asian markets, but there are subtle differences between different countries, and also subtle differences between different types of users.
Thank you so much, Rosaleen. Flor, please, if you want to comment.
Well, it's really interesting what you're saying. I mean, that's not what they tell you on the tourist tour.
I know.
And it will be so much, right? It will be so much more interesting to hear that story, actually, because they tell you the black and white story in the sense that, no, the danger is Asia and it's used for horrible stuff. So it's a very unnuanced story, actually. And also, I think it's so the management is telling the rangers to tell this to tourists, and it becomes a truth somehow for a lot of people, because there's a lot of people from all over the world coming through these conservancies. So it's an easily spreaded myth in that sense, where it could be knowledge if the message is correct. And now you have James, for instance, who is believing that Asia is like horrible in that sense, right? And he's telling his other friends and people. So I'm actually, yeah. And of course, I understand that it's a story that to, as you mentioned, also to prevent poaching. But yeah, now I'm also thinking that a lot of these trained rangers, for instance, if they some get fired from the job, for instance, and they become poachers with all the knowledge that they have. So it's very dangerous what we tell people, and it should be correct what we tell people, but now often it's not, I guess, then, yeah.
Yeah. That's actually there's been a case of that in Central African Republic, where the European Union funded the training and militarization of rangers, and their funding allowed weapons to be purchased with some of the donor funding, and the weapons were purchased, the training was provided, but of course the government then didn't pay the rangers wages, and they turned their skills and their equipment on the wildlife that they were initially meant to protect. So we do have to be really, really careful about expanding and supporting these kinds of conservation, because they can backfire, because at the end of the day, people need to make a living of some kind, and they'll use the skills they have. So I've been on many kinds of safari type tours with guides where I'm very frustrated. I'm tearing my hair out the minute that I hear the word aphrodisiac, and I'm there as the nerd going, no, no, no. In the original texts, the traditional Chinese medicine is not used as an aphrodisiac. This is a Western myth that's then been kind of transported around the world, and it's really disappointing when I hear people from conservation organisations promote that idea. Because they really ought to know better.
There's another type of trade that is very interesting. It's the pet trade. Affected many species, like parrots, for example. And parrots, many species of parrots were endangered already by the loss of habitat. For example, they need to nest in very thick trees that were cut down. And so they kind of, small populations get even more endangered by being collected for this pet trade. Or monkeys, for example, marmosets, they also, and this happened a lot in the US, for example, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, so that the kind of conservation authority of the US had agents undercover, for example, to kind of try to curtail this kind of pet trade. And I think now with a documentary, what's the name, Tiger King?
Yeah.
It's kind of surfaces as what it is. And yeah, in a way, I'm not sure. I don't know if you know anything about the reception of that documentary, if people are horrified, or if there's also people who are not horrified, maybe.
Yeah, a lot of people like it, I'm afraid. But they like the, how do you say, the theater of it. They almost cannot believe that these characters are real, at least when I talk to people around me. But yeah,
I haven't been able to bring myself to watch it yet. I know I should at some point. Fun?
I managed to watch 2 episodes, and that was it.
Yeah, because again, I mean, you're right. The pet trade, or wanting exotic animals to have in private zoos. When you watch documentaries like that, it really is important to remember that these are built on absolute enormous amounts of animal suffering. Not just in terms of when they're caught and then transported, but then throughout their lives, where they may not be looked after particularly well and their needs aren't being met. And so there's a spectacle around it, but also there's an underlying horrible animal cruelty in the pet trade as well, and in the exotics trade. So, but again, these kinds of animals, they're commodities that circulate and they accumulate money and profits for their owners. And actually, I mean, one of the really interesting things about Sudan, the rhino, is that in some ways he's sort of circulated in commodity circuits while he was alive and was a really important driver of funding and attention. But since he's died, he still circulates through those sort of commodity networks, because tourists are taken to see his grave, and it's a way for the Conservancy to raise money and raise attention. And so Sudan is still, in a sense, doing work and paid work for his former kind of for owners, or captors isn't the right word, but his caregivers, if you like, for those who kind of looked after him. He's still circulating in kind of commodity networks, even though he's dead.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the whole spectacle continues now around the grave, actually. And also what frustrates me is that actually the two females that are left are much more important also for the biodiversity and for the whole survival of the species. And the whole focus, or also from the management, of course, and from social media, and is the man.
Yeah.
Like it's the story of our life, maybe, I don't know. But so I was, it's also like how we build up the film, of course, that almost towards the end, you understand, oh my God, there's two females that are much more important. That's actually how the story is designed by Opegita and the PR people of the Conservancy. So, yeah. And still, now that he's dead, he's more famous than the two females who are still alive, actually. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, both Flora and Rosaleen, for bringing the spectacular dimension of biodiversity conservation into the discussion. And part of this story is the involvement of celebrities, right, in various biodiversity conservation programs. And we have them everywhere, not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Europe. And I would like to ask Monica if she would like to give us a few points on involvement of celebrities in nature conservation, like virgin forest or other species that she witnessed in Europe or in the Carpathians or in the return of the bison in Romania, and how important was that participation of royals, for example, or other actors or celebrities?
Well, to begin with, in a way, I think we are very critical of conservation, and that might be, I mean, in a way, it's wonderful that attention is attracted finally to the drama, in a way, of animal and other than human life, so to say. So, in a way, for people who are watching this, I think in a way it's great that celebrities also take on this role, and they kind of are trying to do their best for good causes. And this, we've seen this kind of lately more and more, like celebrities speaking up against the politics that they don't agree with, and all of these kind of forms, which I salute in a way. And I think it's a good point. I think it's a good contribution. What in the case of Romania, Leonardo DiCaprio spoke for the and that's for the virgin forests in Romania, and that's George's topic. Actually, he can tell us about it. At the bison, like when bison was brought, there were the royal family of Liechtenstein, I think, participated, and also Prince Charles is kind of involved in different causes. And of course, I think, yeah, it's a way of mobilizing a certain type of attention, and everybody's watching the stars and all the time anyway. So why not seeing Leo DiCaprio talking about virgin forests in Romania? I think that's my.
Thank you so much, Monica. How efficient do you think this involvement of celebrity is, both Flor or Rosaleen, because it's one of the aspects of both your work?
Well, Rosaleen, you go first.
Yes, the role of celebrity. I appreciate, and I am sounding really hypercritical about everything, but that's me. So I think there's a few different things to say about celebrity. I mean, there is, in conservation, there's definitely a sort of an integration of European royalty and celebrity around particular kinds of environmental issues. And while on the one hand we can say, yes, they drive attention and sometimes can draw attention to issues, and then there's more funding and more kind of political will to do something about a particular issue or to save a particular species. We have to look at the way celebrities and royalty shape public understandings of what counts and what's important, what should be conserved and what shouldn't be conserved, what kinds of visions of environments or visions of wilderness that they bring into being through the ways that they can mobilize public attention, but then also mobilize funding. So it's really interesting that you mentioned the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation, because, his backing of a film of the Netflix documentary Virunga, that's a really that's a white vision of Africa, and it has a white savior who's a sort of celebrity member of European royalty, Emmanuel de Merode, at the center of the story. And now Leonardo DiCaprio is backing a big budget sort of Hollywood movie version of Virunga as well. And that will continue to inform a much wider public understanding of what challenges Virunga faces, and it will inform the way people see Virunga and who they will support in Virunga. But what's missing from that story, from both the Netflix documentary and I suspect from the big budget remake of it, is that there will be an absolute blind spot around the very clearly documented abuses by rangers employed as part of the Virunga Park, and the knowledge of those abuses that donors and the international networks that support the park are well aware of. So we do have to be really careful about, what kind of role celebrities play, and the ways that they shape public understandings of particular issues, because these documentaries, if I ask people about Virunga, what they know is the Netflix documentary. They don't know all the other kind of, the academic studies that are about human rights abuses at the hands of the park authorities, or they know that what's in the media about, the really tragic killings of rangers by militia groups in the area as well. So we do have to be careful about that. And then also, although it's not specifically about environment, Dan Brockington wrote a book about celebrity and development and international development. And one of the really interesting things he found in that was that actually celebrity involvement in development issues didn't really change how people acted or what they thought. It didn't really have the kind of impact that celebrities thought that they did. Celebrities thought that they were really doing something, and actually they weren't really changing anything in the sort of development sector. So I think there are a few issues around celebrities and royalty and philanthropy, and I think it is problematic if celebrities, royalty and philanthropists can essentially purchase the vision of nature that they want to see, which can then have highly unjust outcomes for people in the area who may be evicted or displaced or excluded in some kind of way. And then that creates a model of conservation which isn't sustainable in the longer term.
Yeah, I agree with that. And actually also, it's the simplification of the message is always a big danger. But that's always the battle in a way, because how do you win a cause? Do you try to give people what they are used to and what they appreciate, and what, you know, a simple message, even though it might be, you know, really kind of obliterating many things, or try to be honest with what you believe and give a complex picture that will not reach that many people. That's always.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think sometimes in a very knowing way, some of these celebrities, they know that some of the stories or narratives that they put out, they know that they're ignoring that people have been killed or tortured or raped by parks authorities, but they won't speak out about it. It's too difficult. It's a negative message. And actually, I think they're wrong, and they should be speaking out about that. It's really important. If we want a socially just form of conservation, if we want conservation to really work in the longer term, we can't pretend that abuses don't happen. And they should be using, I think they should be using their power and their network to draw attention to those issues and to really address them fully and tackle them and ensure that they don't continue. Because by pretending that's not happening, they're complicit.
Yeah, I totally agree in the sense that, of course, it's good to be on the side of nature and to be on the side of biodiversity, right? So it's also for you as a celebrity, it shines good light on you in that sense, I think, or it makes you a positive person. And therefore, you should be critical if you know about these things, because otherwise it's just about you doing good and it's reflecting back on you in a good way, although you know that there's more to it actually. And also the thing for me with celebrities is that it's mostly Western people or white people. And so there's this white savior complex that is also enforced by them. It's already there, of course, but it's enforced. Why do we all listen to Leonardo DiCaprio and not to James, for instance, right? Of course, I know that, like, yes, we like stars, but there's to me that sometimes it's tough that it's like this, yeah.
And your documentary does a very good job in bringing a human face to the ranger and to the caretaker, and I'm very happy that I have witnessed that in the documentary. Now, I would like to go a bit to the role of local communities in making sure that conservation is a success. And I would like to ask you, Flor, a bit about the local community around the Conservancy. We don't see them too much. It looks like the Conservancy is a universe in itself. I think there is a scene when we have the elephant carcass, and in the background we see some cattle. Yeah. Probably that's a sign of the local community, but not more. Was this a conscious choice in making the documentary, or was it something that was not deliberate?
Yeah, we chose to make the film within the universe of Sudan, actually within the borders of Opecheta Conservancy, because it's already a multi-layered story and a mosaic kind of story. And of course, there's much more to tell and much more interesting things going on. But we chose in the end to really focus on Sudan in the middle and the people involved, and therefore within the borders of the Conservancy and the science, of course, who are working on the species. But of course, they are surrounded. It's not a really big conservancy, actually, and they're surrounded by communities. And yes, they have parts of the Conservancy where the communities can come with their cattle, actually. And also they have a cattle ranch on Opecheta selling their own beef. And that's also a collaboration with the communities around it. And yes, as I mentioned before, I think also in the way that the Conservancy operates is that the communities around them are their eyes and their ears. So for them, it's very important that they have a good relationship to the communities around them. So the way they do this is to, how do you say, bring water points to the communities and have schools in the communities and stuff like this, provide jobs, but still it's a conservancy with a fence around it, and outside the fence is Kenya in a sense. So yeah, they are there, but not so much in the film. And of course, also there's a lot of European and American visitors are people from all over the world, but the communities and the Kenyans can actually enter for free. They can go to see Opegita because it's part of their heritage. That's their thoughts, at least. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Monica, would you like to move a bit the focus to Europe and tell us a bit the involvement of local communities in particular programs of reintroduction of species or return of the species? I'm thinking of European bison in Romania, but you don't have to focus on this if you have other examples in mind.
I think we should think of particular cases because they are very different. So human-animal relationships are really different, and local communities are also not a unified body. There's different people, different actors having different relationships with animals, different roles in conservation and so on. We can see, I mean, worldwide in a way, there are a few models, for example, the Indian model, so to say, of coexistence. This is always, you know, well, as a gross generalization in a way, but in India, for example, it's really like also the religious factor is important because so many animal gods kind of make people very, so to say, tolerant towards tigers and elephants, and there's a history of trying to coexist. While in Europe, for example, you have I would say the German model, but it's not only German. And what we see also in the movie by Martin with the wolves at the border, we see how people are not tolerant of wildlife. And you know, in Germany, if you have a wolf or a bear, the whole community would kind of, most of the time, you would have voices that want to kill it. And we see in Martin's movie that this also has something to do with Christianity and how wildlife and the forest was perceived as the other, the realm of the devil, of the unknown, and so on and so forth. So there are these very different models. Of course, in the case of the bison, for example, there's a lot of nationalistic issues playing in because the bison in Romania and in Poland is a symbol of national identity. And so people are proud in a nationalistic, and not only in a nationalistic way, to have this animal that they don't know much about, but they associate with the cow, more or less, you know, a furry wild cow. So we see really different models of interaction, and we see local communities in Europe being against conservation, but also welcoming the return of wildlife. In Britain, for example, there's a strong movement for rewilding that is supported by certain communities, but also opposed by many communities. And it also depends on the animals, of course, all the time, because predators, raptor birds are not welcome by pastoralist communities, for example, but other animals maybe are, you know. And that's also, you know, the role of science sometimes is to show, you know, to bring in all of this kind of the view of the ecosystem and what animals can do for an ecosystem, like the connection between wolves and water, for example, in Martin's movie. And if scientists are present in these communities and they try to shape the opinion in a certain way, and that's important as well. So there's a lot of factors that play in how the local communities accept, not accept, who accepts in a community, who doesn't accept, what kind of relations are formed over time. Yeah, I think.
Thank you so much. And related to this, we have a question from the audience. Someone asks you, any of you, to reflect on the double standards of Western people who want to save the animals in Africa, but they do not accept wildlife in their own backyards in Western Europe, for example. Any of you can reflect on that?
Yeah, I mean, I can say something about that. Yes, I think there's a terrible double standard. And it goes back to something I said right at the beginning, and it's in part, it's a very colonial attitude that, you know, there are certain types of wildlife that are worth saving, and I think they are worth saving, don't get me wrong, that are worth saving, but in order to save them, there are certain kinds of people who are disposable. So those people can be dispossessed, those people can be killed, those people can have their human rights abused in order to protect the animals. And I think this is totally the wrong way to think about conservation. And it's extremely frustrating when you see or hear or read people, celebrities, also sort of more widely people in the general public on social media, you know, shouting about the need to protect elephants and rhinos. But if you ask them, well, shall we reintroduce wolves, or shall we reintroduce, I mean, even, you know, things like the sea eagles, you know, should we reintroduce those? No, you know, they're dangerous. And there is a kind of a long-standing criticism of Western conservation that, you know, most Western countries have you know, exterminated their big dangerous wildlife, but they expect everyone else to protect and save theirs so that those same wealthy people can come and look at them on holiday. So there has to be a better model that we can use, and one that's built on a sort of a, you know, coexistence and a sort of mutual respect between human and non-human animals. And that's kind of built on a completely different way of thinking. And I was really glad that Monica brought up the sort of issue of Christianity as well, you know, because Christian thought did introduce those ideas of hierarchies between species and the idea of human stewardship over nature, which then informs these very colonial models of conservation that we see in Africa. And so I mean, it's a big ask, but we have to unpick all of those modes of thinking in order to build a much more hopeful and better future, one that's built around coexistence rather than one that's built on these kinds of double standards. I absolutely agree with the member of the audience, or the sentiment that was behind that question.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Someone else asks if any of you know of spontaneous examples of conservation by local communities. If you have any example of local communities who just work together to protect a species or to preserve a species without external pressure or without state support. I may think of ICCAs, for example, or this kind of local communities that protect a particular territory or a species because they attach certain meanings to it. If any of you can have a few points on that, you are welcome. You mentioned, Monica, the example of the bison that is important for nationalistic purposes. Maybe if you have an example of species that is valorized locally for certain features or symbols, and this led to a better conservation, for example.
I can't think of a particular community in that way, as we think of it as an idealized little community somewhere remote. But of course, yeah, there would be, for example, I will work on a case of a parrot that kind of disappeared from the southern United States. And of course, it's always like locals can ring the alarm and they see that the parrots are not there anymore. And they try to do something. And this project was a small project, and luckily they had a good ornithologist in this, but this was like a more or less, yeah, a small community, and they worked with the local agents and not on a big budget of, like, as we think about bison, or not in the sense of projects that we think about today. I can't think of other, but I'll think about it. If you have something, maybe I come in.
I think that there are many African cultures that have specific species that are valued by that culture, and so it's not allowed to hunt them or destroy them or to disturb them in any way. So And as well, that extends into the Indian Ocean. So somewhere like Madagascar, for instance, different communities within different parts of Madagascar have a sort of traditions about there's a particular type of lemur that you must not hunt or disturb, but all the other lemurs can be hunted, and that the lemur that must not be disturbed is different for different areas, and that acts as a sort of means of conserving the lemur populations overall. But that's often completely ignored by conservation biologists and by conservation NGOs, who come in with an idea that they know better and that the best way to do things is to make sure that none of them are disturbed and that you put a fence around them, and then that's enforced. So there are lots of communities around the world that have particular species as these sort of special species that shouldn't be hunted or disturbed or used in any kind of a way. But those kinds of long-held traditional beliefs, of course, they get they get eroded and broken down through sort of successive waves of colonialism and the ways that new ideas come into particular areas. But we can also see in places, in these sort of indigenous conserved areas in Australia as well, that indigenous communities have been much more successful at conserving indigenous species of plants and animals than Western conservation models. And so it's really important to look at models that are those that are provided by ICCAs, for instance, or indigenous reserves in Latin America, and learn the lessons from those, and to really kind of decolonize our thinking and our practices in conservation, and to really recognize the kind of long-term in-depth knowledge that communities have of their environments, rather than ignoring that knowledge. Because local communities may articulate conservation ideas in a very different kind of a way that is not immediately intelligible to kind of Western scientists, and then there can be a kind of a clash of cultures. But I think Western science in particular needs to decolonize its thinking and its practices, and really recognize that different communities around the world have really valuable knowledge that we can't afford to lose if we want to have a sustainable future.
Thank you so much for reflecting on this. I think it's very important not to forget the role of local communities, because sometimes they tend to be forgotten or not invited in when these decisions are made with regards to conserving a certain species or a certain habitat. And here in Romania, we had many conflicts that emerge from this type of misunderstanding of the role of the local community. And I want to thank you for for casting a light on that.
But sometimes the role of communities can also be quite invisible in a certain way, because
why so?
Sometimes if they preserve a forest, it means preserving the species in it and so on and so forth, but without coming out as a bit, or if you provide, I don't know, carcasses or meat for raptors, for example, by keeping domestic animals and so on and so forth. So these kind of ways are kind of sometimes quite invisible.
Yeah, there's a quite a famous academic book. It's quite old now, but it was Melissa Leach and James Faird wrote The Lie of the Land. That's about the sort of Sahel region in West Africa, where there'd been a long-standing colonial and Western assumption that there'd been deforestation. But when they actually looked at satellite imagery, it showed that tree cover had actually increased in the area. And that was down to the fact that the communities on the ground planted trees around their settlements. And so as people expanded, tree cover expanded. And so there wasn't this sort of easy, numbers. The assumption is that because numbers of people had expanded, then obviously to a Western eye, then deforestation must have happened. But actually, when you looked at the records, it just showed that the more people there were, the more forests there were, or the more tree cover there was, which then had a knock-on effect for biodiversity more widely. And the same goes for Berber gardens in Egypt, where Berber communities plant gardens in the small valleys. and they're really important for biodiversity in a desert area. They're often not, they're overlooked by West, because they're not wilderness areas, they're cultivated areas, but they're really important for insects and for small animals that otherwise wouldn't be able to survive in the desert conditions.
There's another example that I'm thinking of the dingo in Australia, for example, and it's, so dingoes are shot and kind of considered a danger, but then you have these kind of remote communities of not the, well, you have also the indigenous people, but you have also communities of hippies, for example, communes, and you have lots of people there who are very friendly to wildlife, and they save dingoes, for example. Or you know, it's, you have lots of examples like that kind of people who have a role in the end.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for bringing so many facets to our discussion. I think we had a very, very rich talk, and I'm sure that the audience was very happy to stay with us this evening. I remind you that the discussion will still be available on the Pelicam Facebook page if you want to check it later for future reference. I want to thank again from the part of the entire team to Monica Vasile, to Rosaleen Duffy, and to Floor van der Meulen for being with us this evening. And I wish you a very beautiful weekend.
Thank you very much for this talk.
Great, thank you.
You too.
And thank you, Rosaleen and Floor.
Yes, it was really nice talking to you. I learned a lot. Thank you.
I played the devil's advocate with the celebrities, but I was very convinced by Rosaleen in the end.
That's great. That's funny.
Our purpose was not to convince anyone of anything, mostly to raise this issue for further discussion, and to make people come to the festival and continue being with us.
Yeah. No, it's really nice.
So thank you so much.
Right. Thank you.
Thank
George.
you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.